Hello everyone and welcome to SysKit's webinar with one and only Todd Klindt, who will demystify Office 365 groups once and for all. My name is Ante and I'm Product Marketing Manager here at SysKit, and I will assist Todd during today's webinar. Todd doesn't require much introduction, but as many of you know him already, but it doesn't hurt to mention that he has over 15 years experience with SharePoint, and that he has become one of the most influential people in the SharePoint community, as well as Microsoft MVP. He specialized at infrastructure and administration topic for both SharePoint and Office 365, and you can often hear him speak at major conferences all over the world. Let me tell you about us, SysKit, in short. We are a software development company based in Croatia, and we focus on creating tools for SharePoint, Office 365, Microsoft Windows Remote Desktop Services, and Citrix. You probably heard of some of our tools, such as AspDocket, SysKit Security Manager, or SysKit Insights. We started our journey in 2009, and we have thousands of customers in over 75 countries worldwide, many of which are Fortune 500 companies. So if you have questions about us as a company or our tools, please feel free to contact us through our website. Now a bit about important information for attendees during this webinar. Tomorrow we will be sending you a slide deck and recording of a webinar, so if you miss something, do not despair, you will be able to see it again. And at the end of the webinar, we will have a Q&A section in which Todd will try to answer as many of your questions as possible. So please feel free to ask him anything you want through GoToWebinar applications. Todd, I will make you a presenter now so you can take over and start your presentations. Can you hear us well?
I can, and I don't think I like that whole try to answer questions. Your lack of...
I'm sorry for doubting you. I meant we will try, as there will be so many.
There we go. All right, so it's grayed out for me to share my screen. Do you have to stop sharing yours? There we go.
Yes.
All right, let's hopefully I don't share anything embarrassing.
I don't think you will.
All those chat windows with my mom and all that. Okay, I think we are good to go. So thank you very much for that very flattering introduction. Speaking of my mom, she could not have done a better job introducing me if she'd done it herself. This is the agenda for today's talk. Ante has already told you a little bit about SysKit. They're a great company. I have known them since the beginning. I'm good friends with Tony, one of the founders, and I have always, I had a weird relationship with them when he first came out with SP.kit 10 years ago. I was convinced that it wasn't that valuable, that I could do all the documentation myself. What possible value would this tool have? And I felt that way until I actually used it, and then I fell in love with it, and I've been a big fan of theirs ever since. So, and it's 10 years. It's amazing to believe. Today, we're going to talk about Office 365 groups. This is another one of those things that I didn't like initially. I was confused and befuddled by them, and then started playing with them a little bit, and honestly, kind of like them. So I do this talk about groups, and hopefully, I can't see, you know, this with GoToWebinar, I can't see the twinkle in your eye when things start to light up, but I'm just imagining of the people signed up, that, you know, I will see light bulbs going off. And I'm looking at the attendee list. I see a lot of familiar faces, well, I don't see any familiar faces. I see a lot of familiar names, so that'll be good. I can imagine the eyes lighting up. So these are the agenda points that we're going to go through. Essentially, we're going to talk a little bit about what Office 365 groups are, just to make sure that we've all got the same vernacular and vocabulary. And then I'm going to talk about some of the pain points that I've experienced with Office 365 groups and that my customers come to me with. So I'm a consultant by trade. I work for a company called Praxis Consulting with Mark Anderson, Julie Turner, and Derek Cash Peters. And I do Office 365 and SharePoint all day long. So a lot of these pain points that I'm going to talk about are not made up things. They're not stuff from white papers that I've read, never experienced. They're discussions I have with actual customers. So we will talk about those, and then I'll spend a little bit of time, just a little bit, not much, at the end talking about SysKit Security Manager and how it can help alleviate some of these pain points. I do have the question window open right now, so if you've got a question, you can ask it in there. I try to run a pretty loose ship, so if you've got something, I will talk about it, bring it up in there. If it's something that's going to take a while, I might take it offline. On my vanity slide in there, Ante had my email address and my Twitter and all that. Feel free to reach out to me, ask me any questions, things like that. Happy to help. Let's get going. So what are these Office 365 groups anyway? This is one of those things, is something that I really struggled with when I first heard about Office 365 groups, which are like 4 years old now. I think they came out in 2015. One of the things that Microsoft does, and you can't tell right now, but I'm shaking my fist at the sky menacingly. One of the things that Microsoft does is they give products these common names, common words, in this case a common noun as a name for something. And for groups, it was particularly frustrating because like I already knew what a group was. I've been an IT pro for 20 years now, and there's already groups. There's Active Directory groups. There's distribution lists that are groups. I mean, there are people inside of businesses that work together for common goals that are groups. It really became confusing what this other group was, this Office 365 group. And I found out that I was not the only one that suffered this same confusion point. So when I do this talk in front of people or in front of customers or things like that, I like to do a little thing that kind of helps explain this. I say, who in the room is an IT pro? And I look and see who raises their hand. By this point, usually 2 or 3 people have nodded off, so I'm not going to get, going to hear from them. But I say, okay, for the IT pros, an Office 365 group is nothing but an Active Directory security group that we've been dealing with for 20 years now. It is just an Active Directory security group. It's a security principle. It's got a GUID. You put users in it. You apply, it is something you apply permissions with. But the thing that's different is when you create this Office 365 group, when you do all those other things in the background, there are these little robots scurrying about in the background in Office 365 creating things. And they're creating SharePoint sites, they're creating Outlook distribution lists, they're creating things in Azure Active Directory, they're going out to Planner and they're creating plans, they're doing all these little things, and that's kind of the beauty of Office 365 groups, and that's the big thing that differentiates them from Azure Active Directory groups. And that kind of, I can see the IT pro lights go on. But then I see, again, part of the room is probably snoozing by now, but then part of the room is IT pros. Or not IT pros, end users, people, just worker bees, people in accounting, janitorial staff, whatever. And so then the next thing I say is, who here is not an IT pro? Who is just an end user? And hopefully a few people raise their hand. And I say, okay, Office 365 groups are just like the distribution lists that you create in Outlook. So if you go into Outlook and you create a distribution list for the family reunion and you add Aunt Becky, not Aunt Becky, she's in big trouble right now. You add Uncle Fred and Cousin John and all those folks in this distribution list, and you can send them emails and things like that. Office 365 groups are just like that, except when you create this distribution list, in the background, there are all these little robots scurrying around in Office 365, and they're creating resources this distribution list will have access to. So there's going to be a SharePoint site where you can share pictures of the family reunion and maybe a team. Well, if you create it in Outlook, you don't get a team right away, but you can add a team where you can chat about the family reunion. It's all those things that this distribution list has access to. So that's kind of a good way to explain it. Just kind of depends. It's like the fable about the elephant, all the different blind men feeling the elephant. It's all the same animal, but they just come at it from different perspectives. That's what an Office 365 group is. Now we have somebody who's already posed a question, an impatient viewer, very excited about Office 365 groups. Becky would like to know what the difference between a group and a team are. Becky, this is the part of the show where I build anticipation. I'm going to tell you later what the difference between groups and teams are. So just don't go anywhere. Stay put. The answer to your question is hidden somewhere in the rest of the slide deck. So we have all these different kind of groups, either like an AD group or a distribution list, however you want to think of it. Why do we want to do this? What was broken about the system before? Well, for one reason, we've got one-stop management. Office 365 is a big footprint, and Microsoft wants you to use all of the products that they've got, so that obviously, because there's a lot of functionality there, they want some licensing revenue, but also it just makes good sense to have the product inside of Microsoft that does something be the only one that does it. So we've got Teams, which is a chat client, and it does voice chat and does text chat, but every once in a while people in Teams want to save files or set up a calendar or something like that. Why would we have the Teams product group write calendaring and file sharing and all that when we've got the SharePoint group that already does file sharing? We've got the Exchange group that already does calendaring. Office 365 Teams allow you to share functionality between applications without every application group having to rewrite or recreate the wheel. So that's one way. And then you can manage it all in one place. So now if I'm mostly using Microsoft Teams as my way for collaboration, in the background there's a SharePoint thing that I don't know about, but I don't care as long as I can upload that really important spreadsheet. But if I want to give somebody else permission or delete something, Groups takes care of that. I can do it in my application of choice. I can do it in Teams, and it will do it everywhere else, and it's really easy for the user. Another great reason is security, compliance, governance. Now that I've got all these things wrapped inside of a group, I don't have to worry about keeping compliance policies consistent between Teams and SharePoint and all that. If I create a group and I give it a compliance policy of confidential, then no matter how a user uploads something or where they put it, it's going to have that same compliance policy. So it keeps data safe, makes it easy for discoverability, things like that. For the end user or for the IT pro, it's easier to manage. And again, it makes it easier for you to use these other services. I had a customer who uses Office 365, but he's, a basic customer. He does a lot of work with external clients, scheduling things and all that. And he's like, I need to set this thing up in SharePoint. I need to have, basically he was talking about using something like Microsoft Project from a while back. And I reminded him, I'm like, well, you've already got Planner. How do I add users? How do I do all this? I'm like, you've already done it. You're already using Office 365 groups. It's already there. They already have access. Without Office 365 groups, it wouldn't have been nearly as easy to get him set up with that. So that is what Office 365 groups are. Now, I know I've done a great job making them sound amazing. I'm surprised that you all haven't left now to run out and create some Office 365 groups and start playing with them, but they aren't without their pain points. And so we're going to talk a little bit about the pain points that groups have and kind of how to get around them. And my clicker is not clicking. There we go. All right. Pain point one, groups are all over your tenant. Now, one of the good things about Office 365 groups is when you create them, they create resources all over in your tenant. One of the bad things about Office 365 groups is they create resources all over your tenant, everywhere. You're just a user. You just want to create a chat room in Teams. You don't want anything else. And the next thing you know, you've got plans and streams, whatever those are, and SharePoint and all kinds of stuff. And so you have to know about how that all works. So how does this how does this happen if you're just innocently trying to create a distribution list in Outlook? What happens? Well, the first thing to keep in mind is there are, I think, if I'm going to guess, 20-ish places, probably a couple dozen different places where you can create a group. And the idea behind that is that you will create the group wherever the most correct place for your collaboration is going to be. If you're going to be doing heavy document collaboration and you've got somebody like me as a consultant coming in, then I'm seeing a lot of things, lost audio. Okay, so somebody post a question if they can hear me. So however, if you've got a consultant like me helping you roll out Office 365, I am a SharePoint guy, so I'm going to tell you to create your content in SharePoint. You should create your groups in SharePoint. You shouldn't say, well, I saw that I can create them in Teams. I'm going to do that. Go ahead and create them in SharePoint. If you are team-centric, if your collaboration is real-time and you've got the whole Office of the future and that thing going on, you should create your Office 365 group in Teams. Whatever your primary collaboration modality is, that's where you should create your Office 365 group. And then it will take care of creating it everywhere inside of Office 365. One of the things that makes Office 365 groups tough to keep track of is they can be public or private. And if one is private, then it's not easy for everybody to see that one's out there. So somebody might create another one and not know that there's already one out there because they can't see the one. And we're going to talk about public and private here in another slide on what the difference is between that. And one thing to be aware of, not only does Office 365 groups give, they also take away. So when you create an Office 365 group, it creates stuff all over your tenant. It's well-intentioned. It means to do that. But when you delete your Office 365 group, it deletes everything all over your tenant. It tries to clean up after itself. And that's generally a good thing if you really mean to clean things up. But if you don't mean to clean things up, that can really take you by surprise. And when I first started using groups several years ago, I got nabbed by that. Somebody didn't recognize, we had, a bigger IT group. One group had created some plans in Planner, and they didn't understand the whole Office 365 group functionality. And then somebody in IT was doing the Azure AD syncing, and they saw some groups that they didn't recognize in Azure AD, and they were trying to be very clean, which is good. I like platform hygiene, and they deleted that group, not understanding that it would delete all the SharePoint stuff and all the team stuff, and it all went away. So Helga in the chat room is very concerned about this. She says, is it a soft delete or whatever? You can recover that. We're going to talk about that in a bit, but yes, you can restore these objects. There's a PowerShell to do it and some other things, and they will stick around for 30 days or so. And Christopher, he is saying, shouldn't you create your Office 365 groups in Teams? Because if you make it in SharePoint or Office 365 admin, it does not create an MS team or channel. Yes, Christopher, that gives me a good segue into my next slide. I will talk about that. But you can also see on this slide right here, they've added some new things in the last couple of years. Christopher's right that if you create your group, depending on where you create it, you get a different set of resources. And if you create it in SharePoint, the way that I do as a SharePoint person, it does not create a team automatically. But you can teamify an existing group. If you go into Teams and you say, I want to create a team, if you are an owner of an Office 365 group, it will give you the option of creating a team based on that group name and add the team to that existing group. So you don't lose anything if you create it that way. Let's see some other groups. How do we measure activity? We will talk about that a little bit later, Nathaniel. Okay, so let's go on. Let's talk about, we've had a couple of questions about the next slide. Let's talk about that one. So as Christopher mentioned, depending on where you create the group, you get a different set of resources. Now, one thing that I like to tell folks is I know my way around SharePoint and Office 365 pretty well. My PowerPoint skills, even after all these years of doing public speaking, are sad at best, pathetic in most cases. And you can always tell when I create a slide as opposed to when I steal a slide from somebody else. And this is a combination of that. I created this slide, but I stole the image from Matt Wade at icansharepoint.com. And this is a great image. I've got the URL down there. You should all be going to icansharepoint.com anyway, but this is a really good article that he's got, this big infographic on Office 365 groups. So I took a little snapshot out of the middle with that. So Office 365 groups sort of have like 3 modalities, they call them, and I just really like the word modality. It's just fun to say. When you create a group, you can create 3 different kinds of groups. You can create an Office or an Outlook group. So that's the kind that you get if you create it in SharePoint or Outlook or whatever. You get the distribution list, you get the SharePoint site, those kind of things. You can create it in Teams, and so those are the light blue here in the infographic. Like Christopher mentioned, if you create it in Teams, you get all of that, plus you get a Microsoft team. So you can, and like I said, you can add that later. And then finally, the third type of group is a Yammer group. And I don't think anybody does that has not lost a bet or has been dared or has been up too late the night before. But when you do that, obviously, there's a lot of overlap between Yammer and Teams. So when you do the Yammer group, you don't get the team and some other stuff because you can do all that stuff in Yammer. Let's see, we got some questions. Can I create a group from Teams and add an existing SharePoint site? You cannot. When you create the group inside of Teams, it creates a new SharePoint site. You can copy your data over, but you can't connect to an existing one. And I mentioned earlier that if you have a SharePoint site, you can groupify it. So I guess there's probably a way around that. You can go to a SharePoint site that was created before groups. You can groupify it. You can do that in the UI, or as an admin, you can do it with PowerShell. And then I suppose after that group is created, then you can go into Teams and add that. So you can teamify the group that you created with SharePoint. So I've not tried that particular thing, but we can try that. Roger's asking, is there a way to prevent users from creating groups? Yes, there is. We will cover that later. So Raymond is asking what my position is on Teams versus Yammer. I'm not a huge fan of Yammer. I've just never really gotten into that. I'm sure it's a very viable product. I'm sure its parents love it and people use it all the time. It's just never been the right fit for me. Teams is a little bit better. I like the concept of Teams. The Teams client and I don't always get along, but I probably like it better. Let's see a little bit more about that. So that's pain point number one. You've got stuff all over. You got to keep track of it when you delete it, when you create it. Some stuff gets created some way, some stuff gets created another way. Pain point two is, who are the players? Like what's going on in the background here? Now, I don't know if you guys noticed in my vanity slide, I was very blatantly pandering to my friends at SysKit. Like Ante said, they're based out of Zagreb, Croatia. They've got a beautiful office. I was there a couple of months ago. Love the company, love the office, love Croatia. And I had a picture in my vanity slide, and it was me in my very comfortable and aesthetically pleasing SysKit admin shirt, standing next to my shoddily printed out SysKit sign in my office, as one does on a Tuesday morning. And in another blatant attempt to suck up to my friends in Croatia, I've got a picture here of the Croatian soccer team that was at the World Cup last year. But who are the players in Office 365 groups? For SharePoint folks, this is frustrating because Office 365 group permissions are very limited compared to what we could do in SharePoint. In SharePoint, the permissions model was maddening and frustrating, and I said many unkind words about it when I was using it, but I could almost always dial in exactly the permission that I wanted with it. Because Office 365 groups span so many products, the permission model has to be, by definition, the least common denominator. It's got to be a permission level that you can assign to every product all the way around the suite. So, if you've got, in the permission levels inside of SharePoint, there's 2 or 3 dozen of them. I forget what they all are, but they don't all map to something inside of Teams or Stream or Planner or whatever. So inside of groups, it's very, very limited. So let's talk about that first. We have the group owner. So as you can imagine, they are the owner. They own everything. They have the ability to add and remove users from the group. There are certain group settings that they can change. If you want to invite a guest, they are the type of user that have to approve a guest being in. And for a SharePoint folks, they're like the site collection admin. I mean, they technically are the site collection admin of the SharePoint site, but there's also, it's kind of that big account. I will tell you that you should have multiple owners of your group, and we'll talk about this a little bit later. You don't want to get in a situation where a group has a single owner and that owner leaves the company. They win the lottery or something like that. A rich relative dies and leaves them a lot of money. You don't want to have a group without an owner. You can get around that. We'll talk about that later, but you don't want to leave yourself in that position. So those are owners. And then there are members, and members are regular users. In SharePoint parlance, they're like site members. They have the ability to create content inside of groups, edit content. They can add users, but they can't delete users. So that's a little something extra. But they can create content, add content, those kind of things. So one of the things that you'll notice that's missing is there is no read-only role. There aren't people inside of groups that can just go to a group and look at stuff. And the reason for that is, again, this whole least common denominator security model. So in SharePoint, we've got that. We've got visitors or read-only or whatever, and that can be somebody who just goes to the site, can't see anything, or can see things but can't change anything, can't add people. The reason that that's not there is because when you start thinking about the other products, it just doesn't scale well. And the greatest example I've seen of that is Teams. Like, how do you make somebody read-only in a team chat room? For those of you that have been on the internet for a while, that is called lurking, and that's generally considered kind of creepy. There's no good way to do that, so they don't have that. There is no read-only. If you're concerned about the SharePoint part of a group, you can go in and edit the SharePoint permissions. When you create an Office 365 group and it creates the SharePoint site, it creates security principles in Azure Active Directory that it drops into the applicable SharePoint group. So you've got the owners show up in the SharePoint, the Site Collection Administrators group, and the group members show up in the SharePoint members, I forget what the terminology is, group, and that's how they get their access in SharePoint. You can go in and tweak those permissions. You can go in and add people as read-only. You can move the members group from Azure AD into read-only. I'm not saying I suggest that, but that is a possibility. Now we have this outlier. We have these guests. Guests are like members, but they are outside of your organization. And they don't have access to everything. It's mostly over email. It's kind of a hodgepodge. This was something that feels like Microsoft wasn't planning on adding this, but got a lot of customer feedback and were forced to add it. But it's for people outside of your tenant. So if you would like to add me as a guest to any of your Office 365 groups, go right ahead. You can do that. A group owner has to approve it. A group owner can do it. A group member can nominate somebody and the group owner can approve it. And this is something that IT has to turn on and off. So this is a tenant level setting also that says allow external users to add things. There's some tweaking there, but that's a very high level thing. And again, it just doesn't feel like the rest of the group management. But keeping your mind wrapped around who the players are in your groups, things like that. Lynn Dye asks in the chat room, are we going to show the steps for turning on guests? It is confusing, and I'm going to talk about it later, but I wasn't going to demo it. But Lynn, I'm happy to show you how to do that later, because it's some PowerShell, and it's just not intuitive whatsoever. But we will talk about that in a bit. Mark Chrisman's asking where I got the new logos. So yeah, earlier in the slide deck, I had some of the logos. He noticed the new logos. I don't have all of the new logos, and I can't remember where I downloaded them, Mark. But Mark, you've got my information, so reach out to me offline, and I'll hook you up with what I've got. Maybe together we can get the whole complement of a group of new logos. Michael's asking how we can avoid sprawl. We'll talk about that. Kevin is asking, can Office 365 groups apply permissions across multiple site collections? They cannot, and I'm going to talk about that a little bit later as well, but that is one of the pain points that we will talk about in a bit. So one of the pain points, we know who keeping track of who is in there, who the players are, who can do what. That is a pain point. Once we add guests into the mix, that becomes an even bigger pain point. It becomes difficult to figure out who has access to things. There's about 6 or 8 different ways it feels like to open up files, to share files, things like that. And once you get external people involved, then your security staff really gets worried. And figuring out guests, and then that's also just a point in time thing. You can check on a Tuesday morning what files are exposed externally, and Tuesday afternoon somebody can add a guest to an Office 365 group if that's turned on, and now you've got more exposure. So trying to figure where those are out and trying to find an easy way to do it is very difficult. I talked about this a little bit in the slide before. This is something that you can add. You can manage it in Outlook if you're an end user. You can add them that way. You have to be an owner to send out the invitation. They have to accept it. The emails that they get also have an ability for them to opt out at the bottom, so they can shut that off. And again, it's mostly email based. It's not the same as just giving them permission to a SharePoint site. It's not like that. It's a little clumsier than that. Again, it's one of those things. If you haven't used it yet, before you unleash it on somebody externally, use your Yahoo address or your Alta Vista email address or whatever. Add yourself as a guest and just see what that experience is, because it's kind of clunky. I'm not a big fan of it. So that will be a pain point both in just exposure and management, and just your end users getting upset because it's not a great experience. Managing ownership. So you know who everybody is, but how do you keep on top of that? There's a couple of different ways. Again, groups are all over Office 365, so you can really manage it in any different application. I've got some listed here, but this is not an exhaustive list at all. I'm a SharePoint person, so it's kind of like that whole thing when all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. So when I have any kind of a question like, how do I add people to a thing? Well, you do that in SharePoint. That's just how it is, but there are other ways to do it. You can do it in SharePoint, you can do it in Teams, you can do it in the Outlook application if you've got an updated Outlook application on the left. If you scroll down, all your groups are in there. The groups that you are a member of or an owner of, you can add people in there. You can do it in Outlook Web Access also for end users. IT can do it at the tenant level, so groups are exposed in the Microsoft Office 365 Admin Center and Azure AD Admin Center. So depending on what the permission level is, they can add people that way. A couple of things that I wanted to note, and when we're talking about pain points, it's very applicable. You can't nest groups. So this kind of comes back to Kevin's question about how you can do this. You cannot nest groups. And I know there's some questions going on in people's heads about that, what I mean by that, again, because there's different kinds of groups and all that. For all the questions in your head, sadly, the answer is no. Like, but can I put an Office 365 group inside of an Office 365 group? No. Can I put an Azure AD group inside of an Office 365 group? No. Can I put an Office 365 group inside of an Azure AD group? No. There is no nesting of groups right now, which makes some of the management a little clumsy. Later in the slide deck, I've got an example of how I had to get around that with one customer for whatever reason, and I was never able to get a good explanation out of them. They wanted to have two Office 365 groups with exactly the same permissions. Now, the obvious answer was that why is this not just one group? Again, they weren't able to give me a good answer on that, but they did want to keep them in sync. So their only way to do that was with PowerShell, because I couldn't nest one inside the other. I couldn't make an AD group that I put in both of the Office 365 groups. It was kind of clumsy, and I'll show you later how I did that. But you can use PowerShell for automating all of the management and all that. To make this deck look more dynamic, I added some animations here. So behold my great PowerPoint skills. I'm in an Office 365 group managed SharePoint site here, and I've got the members link up there. You'll notice it doesn't show the pictures anymore. It just says a number. Kind of miss the pictures. If I'm a member or an owner, if I click that membership thing, this shows up. This group has 14 members. I am a member, well, in this one I'm actually an admin, so I can click add members, or Alex Wilbur. He's annoyed me for the last time. That guy goes into the company, the break room with the microwave. He microwaves fish for lunch like 3 days out of 5 every week. Nobody likes Alex, so I'm just going to click member, and I'm gonna delete him. I'm just going to remove him. So again, only an owner can remove somebody, and you can also see that if Alex was somehow able to make things right, bring in cookies or cake or something, I could upgrade him to an owner in this also. And Andrew asked if there would be a recording. There is, but the folks at SysKit will send him an email out. He will be so happy to hear about that. Daler, and I apologize if I'm mispronouncing your name, is asking, is it true that if you add a security group to the group as a member, and if you add later members to that same security group, they are not updated? Yes. So you can't add a security group to an Office 365 group, but this question comes up enough that there must be some interface somewhere that allows that, and I've not been able to find it, so I don't know if you're doing this in PowerShell or where you're doing it, maybe Outlook. I don't think I've tried that. But if you do add a security group to an Office 365 group, if you're in one of the interfaces that allows that, what happens in the background, and I don't know if it happens in the UI, is that security group is expanded and all of the members of that group are added to your Office 365 group. So if you add members to that Office 365 or that Azure AD group outside of Office, they will not be updated. So that's that comes up all the time. So unfortunate. Nothing else on that. Okay. Pain point number 5, and you guys have been asking a lot of these questions in the chat room, which is good because that means that I'm not the only one that's having these kind of pain points. How does IT have a chance keeping up on all this? So one of the reasons I'm a big fan of SharePoint is because it makes me as an IT guy able to offload some of the work onto the end users. Some folks might call that lazy. I like to think of it as efficient. I like to think of it as just getting out of the way of people doing their jobs. And in reality, I mean, all joking aside, that's really what any end user wants. They just want to do their job. And the more hurdles that IT puts in the way, the greater the chance that this end user is going to do the whole shadow IT thing, which sounds way more exciting than it really is. And by shadow IT, I mean, if we shut off external access, for sharing in SharePoint, or we disable groups, and somebody in accounting needs to share a document with somebody at a auditing firm or something, completely above board, not breaking any laws or anything, and they try to do it the right way, and there is no way to do it. They're going to email it. They're going to put it in Dropbox. They're going to upload it to somebody else's website and share it that way. They just want to get their job done, and so I really like doing that. One of my philosophies in life is if you want somebody to do something, make it as easy as possible for them to do it. And so I want all my users to use Office 365, keep their files in Office 365. So I'm just going to do everything I can to make that easy. So Lynn asked earlier if we can restrict who can create groups. We can, and like Lynn mentioned, it's a pretty ugly process, and I'll talk about that in a minute, but let's talk about what that actually does. So if I go in and do this ugly process and I restrict who can create groups, that doesn't keep them from creating the individual pieces that would be created with the group. So I can go in and I can say nobody can create groups, but then if a user goes in, they can still create a SharePoint site unless we've gone out of our way to disable that as well. So disabling group creation does not disable the creation of all the other things. Now, Lynn was saying that she had a tough time doing that. Right now, that process is PowerShell only, and it is very complicated and convoluted. It doesn't actually involve a mousetrap in any marbles, but man, it is so close to that. Like I think probably the previous version involved a mousetrap and a marble and some string or something. You need to download the Azure AD PowerShell module. You need to log in as a tenant admin, global admin, and you need to look for an Azure AD policy, domain policy. If it has not been added to your domain, you need to add it through PowerShell. And then you need to copy that policy out and tweak some parameters of that, and then write that back to Azure AD. It is pretty ugly. Maybe that's a good blog post, but then that will do the thing. Now, what that does is that disables who can create groups, but it only disables it for people who are not admins. So anybody who's a SharePoint admin or a tenant admin, they will continue to be able to create groups, but end users will not be able to. And then you can also, part of that policy, you can disable groups, you can disable group creation, but you can create a group that can create, you can name an Azure AD security group that can create Office 365 groups. So maybe you've got a group of trusted help desk folks or something. You can create a group in Azure AD and give that group permission to add or to create Office 365 groups. And so maybe they would be in charge of that. That can be an Azure AD group, so it can be a dynamic group or something like that. That helps. While you're in there, as you're an IT person and you're doing some planning, okay, you can also set some other things up. So you can enforce prefixes or suffixes. So one of the things that happens is, Jim in HR creates a group. Doesn't mean to, means to create something in Teams, doesn't understand, creates a group, he doesn't care. And he calls it HR because he's in HR and it's for HR folks. For anybody else in the company, they don't know that that's not the official HR group. They just have no idea. And if it's public, they can see it, they can add themselves to it, and they don't know that the things going on in there are not official HR things. Now, I mentioned this example that Jim was, very innocent, but what if Jim was malicious? What if he went out and created a group called Office of the President, something like that, and, really meant to cause trouble? Again, there's no great way for end users to determine those. So you can enforce prefixes and suffixes, and those prefixes and suffixes can be static text. So it can be, group dash or user created group dash or something. It can be static text. And there's also a small subset of values you can pull in. So values about the user that created it or their department, things like that. But you can tag them in such a way that by prefix, so that they sort distinctively, or by suffix or whatever, that they stand out as user created groups. When you do this, admins are not affected by it, so they can call a group whatever they want. You can do that. Also, another thing, not specific, well, and we'll talk about the next one too, ban words. So you can ban words, so things like HR and president and all that. So I like to think of this, and I'm stealing this analogy from Mark Anderson. He talks about the namespace land grab. So basically, even before you get out there and have created all of your things, if you're in a new Office 365 tenant, you want to think of all of the names that you don't want people to take land grab, and either ban them or create them and make them in a way that people can't get to them. So you don't want somebody creating an HR site or human resources or office of the president or whatever until you're ready to do it yourself. So you can either ban the word. So if somebody tries to create a group and it's got the word president in it, they will be denied. Or however. And again, admins are not bound by this. So SharePoint admins, whoever can create whatever they want without the banned words. And then part of that that AD policy is enabling guests, disabling guests. And then there's a thing about whether guests can share all that. So that's one of those things when you get in there and get that AD policy, the property names are fairly well defined. So once you can figure that out, you can get in there and see what it can do. But then the other thing that IT needs to figure out is reporting. How are they going to do all this? How are they going to keep an eye on what groups are there and who owns them and what groups don't have owners and things like that? It's pretty complicated. So Michael's asking about exception to expiration policies. We're going to talk about a little bit of that in the next slide. Let's jump in there. Emily is asking what type of analysis tools are available to analyze Office 365 groups. Emily, you have come to the right place. In about 5 or 6 slides or so, I'm going to hit that exact question. Don't go anywhere. Another part of the IT policy and pain points is governance. And governance just means controlling things. These Office 365 groups, especially if you leave it open so that anybody in your company can create them. And honestly, I don't dissuade that. Again, I want to make it easy for people to use the products. I want them to use Office 365 and not the shadow IT stuff. So there's going to be a lot of them. They are going to reproduce like rabbits. So IT needs to have some way to keep track of that. One of the things that IT can do is IT can set a tenant-wide expiration policy, which basically just says that every 30 days or 15 days or whatever, the owner is going to get an email saying, hey, we're going to delete your stuff. Do you want me to keep it? Yes or no. If they say yes, it keeps it. If not, if they say no, then or they don't say anything, they will get continually reminded until it gets deleted. This is a really good reason to have multiple owners, because if an owner is on vacation or sabbatical or just not checking their email or has left the company, you want to have another owner, because if somebody doesn't affirm to Office 365 to keep that group, it will be deleted. And when I say it gets deleted, I mean everything gets deleted. So your SharePoint site, your planner plans, all that stuff. Somebody asked earlier whether you can restore that. You can. It sticks around for 30 days, all of the stuff. Since this isn't like a SharePoint thing, you can't go into the SharePoint site collection recycle place and pull it in there. And it's not a Teams thing, whatever. It's at the Azure AD level. So you need to, again, break out the Azure AD PowerShell. And this is a frustrating thing for me, because if you've used PowerShell at all, you sort of get used to this idea that things are verb-noun, get-user, set-user. And when you're working through those different commandlets, you're used to the noun staying the same if you're doing all the same things with it. And this one is super ugly, because to get the name of the Office 365 group that was deleted, you need to run get Azure AD MS deleted group. That gives you the groups that have been deleted. Then you need to grab the GUID of that group, and then you need to run restore Azure AD MS deleted directory object to restore that group. So it gets a little ugly. So normally when I'm trying to figure something out, I go into PowerShell and I do, get command star.group, whatever the thing I'm trying to do is, and that would expose some of the things, but I couldn't find the restore for it. And so I just had to laboriously work through and figure all that out. You've heard me say a few times that this is only available in PowerShell. The policy management is only available in PowerShell and some other things. This is another good reason to really get proficient at PowerShell. A lot of new functionality is going to show up in PowerShell first, and some functionality is just always going to be in PowerShell. There's just going to be no way around it. And the big reason for that, well, there's two reasons for that. Number one is adding this kind of functionality to a web page is complicated, because you have to worry about where it is on the page. Is the page too busy? What does the page look like? when it gets resized to a tablet, to a phone. So it's just easier to throw a commandlet out into PowerShell or add a parameter to an existing commandlet. The second reason, and this works well since I'm doing this for a Croatian company, is internationalization. If I add something to a web page, now it's got to translate into the 48 languages or whatever that Office 365 is in. And the whole process, if they throw it in PowerShell, they only support PowerShell for English. So that's an easy way for it. So you always have to jump in and do these things in PowerShell. It's just easier. So for restoring stuff, the only way I know how to do this is in the PowerShell. And Steve is asking, is it easy to restore all product objects? Well, it's easy once you know the commandlets. And yes, this does do the entire group. So it all pops back in. It takes a little bit for everything to populate and hydrate. But yes, it all shows up. Michael is asking, can you define exceptions to expiration policies? They have some that they don't want to. Yeah, you can have some groups expire and some not. So you can pull those out, and I can't remember if that's in PowerShell or if that's in the admin interface, but yes, you can control that. But you can only have one expiration policy for your tenant. So you can have one policy that covers all or some of your groups. When you grab the slide deck, you can pull these slides down. This is what Microsoft does. I put these in here not so much as guidance, though there's some stuff in here that I do like, but more knowing that Microsoft is Microsoft's probably most important customer. So as you see how Microsoft IT is managing Office 365, you can see kind of where the product is going and how they expect you to use it. So I'm not going to go through all these because I'm kind of running out of time, but they will be in the slide deck when you download it. And this was from, if you went to Microsoft's How We Use Office 365 Groups session at Ignite, this is where I grabbed all that. We have a couple slides of those, but again, I'm not going to go over all of those. So the last pain point that I'm going to talk about is just management in general. So we've talked about individual things, proliferation, how do you control that, how do you govern it, all this, but just management in general for groups is kind of messy. And again, it's a part of this policy. There is like no groups admin center to go to because groups isn't a thing. It's not a product. So depending on what you're tweaking about the group, you may go to one of the many admin centers that are available to you, and that list grows a little bit. You can see you've got the Azure portal, the Office 365 admin center, Exchange, SharePoint. One of the things that's frustrating with Office 365, and it gets better, but you kind of forget about it, is all these products are linked in the background. But that doesn't always mean the same thing. In some cases, it is a link. So you change something one place, you're changing the reference, you're changing a thing it's referencing. So as soon as you make the change shows up everywhere. But in some places, it's not a reference, it's a copy. And the Teams Admin Center is a great example of that. If somebody has access, if somebody's in the members group of a group in Teams, and you delete them in the Azure portal, it may take up to 2 hours for that user to disappear in Teams because that one is by copy, not by reference. And so the guidance there is if you need to get somebody out of a team, quick, fast, and in a hurry, that you delete them from the Teams admin, and then it will remove itself out of Teams immediately and get synced back into Azure AD. So a lot of this is just whatever tool, is best for the job. For me, I do most of it in the Microsoft 365 Admin Center or SharePoint. That's just what I'm most familiar with. But you can do that, and it's all over. You can also use it in PowerShell. It's also a mess because, again, you've got all these different products. So some things you have to do in the Exchange PowerShell, some in Azure AD, like restoring things. Some you need the patterns and practices PowerShell for SharePoint to make changes. Some in Teams, it's very painful. And this is an example of that. So if I create a new SharePoint site, depending on where I create it, I get different things, which is why it's a mess. And kind of the story here, again, you can groupify one that you create with the SharePoint PowerShell so you don't lose anything. If you create it in the PNP PowerShell, you get the group but no teams, so you can teamify it later. And then if you create it with the Teams PowerShell, then there is no later. It's just all done. So again, it just depends on where you create it. But that's just something that the experience should be the same, but it's not. I mentioned earlier that I had a customer that needed to copy group permissions. We're running out of time on this one, but this is the PowerShell that I had to write 4 pages worth. The good news for you all is, again, you're going to grab this PowerShell deck or this PowerPoint deck, so you can look at all of my PowerShell in all of its glory. But you can also go to my blog and see that story and how that all worked out. This I blogged this one again because this is something that's come up a couple of times, and since you can't nest groups, it gets ugly. But also because the PowerShell is just so clumsy, because it's part graph, part it's really ugly. So that's one way to do that. I know you're all torn right now. You're conflicted. Groups seem amazing. They're going to revolutionize the way we work and play and interact with our families and all of that. But the management seems so scary. However, will we wrap our arms all the way around this? Folks, you are in the right spot. SysKit Security Manager is the way to do it. This is a tool that the folks at SysKit have created, and SysKit is a great company. I could go on and on about that. One of the things that they do is they talk to a lot of their customers. So some of their customers are on the call. They also talk to people out in the field. They bring me in periodically and ask, what I've seen in the field, what solutions or suggestions I have, and they write their products to do that. And one of the things that we've talked to them about, and it was no new news, they already knew it, but group management is painful for people. And so they've added that to the SysKit Security Manager product. So this is just a quick overview of what this can do. This is not a groups-only management tool. This works with SharePoint on-prem. This works with Office 365 and SharePoint groups and all the other things. But it also has a module for groups itself. So you can see here I am looking at a group. I can look for groups. I can run reports on groups. I can see if there's groups with no owners. It creates a report. It kicks out an Excel spreadsheet, so I can see all those kind of things. I can obviously add members here. I can get a report of which groups are sharing files externally, so they can just, again, one big Excel spreadsheet, and it's just all in one spot. Super easy to use. If you want to manage your groups, you can create them in here. One of the things that's tough, again, my example in the PowerShell where I had to write that 4 pages of PowerShell to add people to multiple groups, you can do that in SSM. You can add people to multiple groups at a time. Obviously, you can delete them, things like that. It is just a really friendly tool if you really are jumping in with that. And the screenshots, again, I wish I had more time to walk through this product. It's really fun. But then I found out as I was putting the slide deck together, they're like, we're going to be putting out an even newer version at the end of this month. So if you're listening to this recording, we're at the middle of April 2019. There's going to be a new version of SSM out there at the end of this month, beginning of next month. So I can only imagine what amazing things it's going to add. This is a great product. If you go out to syskit.com and go into products, it's on the left there, SysKit Security Manager. It has a 30-day free trial. So I highly recommend going out there, installing it. Because groups have their little fingers in all different corners of Office 365, it does take a little bit to get everything permissioned correctly. Don't lose faith. Go ahead and do that. The support folks at SysKit are really good. But the first time I installed it, however many months ago, I came in with a question. They knew exactly what I was doing wrong. They had me fixed up in about 30 seconds. So grab it. And if you have any questions, give them a shout. So we have a few minutes left, and I see some questions in the chat room. I've been trying to go through them as we've gone through. The text is very small. So Steve is asking, you can only restore groups through PowerShell. I believe that's the case. There might be an admin UI for it, but I have not looked. I really like PowerShell, and so as soon as I found out the way to do it in PowerShell, I quit looking. It was painful, but I can do that. And if that's something that if people think that would be a valuable blog post, shoot me an email, todd@klint.org, or hit me up on Twitter. I haven't been watching Twitter. Gosh, I hope nothing's going on. And let me know, because that's the kind of thing. I have a real tough time. Once I figure these things out, I assume everybody has seen them, and that's not always the case. So if that's something that would be handy, let me know if I should blog that. Emily is asking, what does the admin model look like for a company of 5,000 users and 2 dedicated admins? Well, I imagine there might be alcohol involved. I don't know. So that seems a little low for IT staff. But, with Office 365, maybe you can do that. I would say you're probably a little bit low. If you've got everything in Office 365, those folks are going to have to know all kinds of stuff, Exchange and PowerShell and SharePoint and all of that. So yeah, I think that seems like a low staff, especially if that includes help desk, training, all that. Another thing that I didn't mention in this deck is because this is Office 365, all of this stuff changes all the time. So things that I said today that were true today might not be true in a couple of months. They might take something away or add something. So you just can't, you always got to be learning. And that's one of the things that makes it really tough for IT departments, is staying up to date on all that. Steve is asking the most effective implementation of groups and teams that I've seen. Oh, I guess, and earlier somebody asked what the difference between, Becky asked what the difference between a team and a group is. This is one of those terminology things. Again, I'm shaking my fist at the sky because Microsoft uses teams and groups and all kinds of things. Teams is a product. It's a chat product that you might use to chat with your team at work, being the people that all complain about the same manager. Teams is also, what you use inside of the product teams to chat with your teams. Teams is also a kind of group that you can create. And so it's the group like the Outlook group, but with the Microsoft team. So the difference between a group and a team is, it all depends on context. So you might have an Office 365 group that is a Teams created group that has the SharePoint, the Planner, whatever, and the Teams group. It gets ugly. Tony, good to see you. So Steve, back to your thing. Most of my customers are very early in their rollouts of this. So I haven't been able to look at one that's, a solid 6 months old to see what works and what doesn't work. I know that with every customer that I've talked to over the last few months with groups, it has been a constantly refined process. So we sat down with them and talked about, what's your company culture like? What's your IT culture like? I think this will work. And then once we start doing it and all these groups appear, then they start getting worried and we start trying to figure out how to manage it. So it's been a moving target. Steve's also asking, does Teams seem like the leading technology? Microsoft is putting a lot of effort into Teams. They're putting a lot of programming effort. They're putting a lot of marketing effort into Teams. Microsoft very much sees Teams, the product, as like the next iteration of Outlook. They want it to be the app that you go into and work out of every day. And so you can have your SharePoint files in there, your calendar in there, you can write apps for it. That's the way they see that. I've got a couple of customers that are doing that, but for the most part, that's been a rough transition, mostly because the Teams client has some pretty glaring deficiencies. And I think until those deficiencies get fixed in the client, like the ability to have multiple instances or pop windows out or be logged into multiple tenants at the same time without painful context switching, that probably won't be adopted. Steve is asking, hi Todd, permission doesn't work when affected from SharePoint Teams site of a Teams group. Any advice? I'm not entirely sure what the problem is, but I would just break into the SharePoint permissions and see, the old like the permissions pages that we had with on-prem SharePoint, jump in there, see who has access to what, move some things around. Not entirely sure. I'm going to look through some of the older questions. You guys asked a lot of great questions. And Helga, he's saying, attended a VIP session with Julia White, name dropper. She got the question, why groups? Her response was, and I quote, we looked at what was working in Yammer, and that was groups, so we created Office 365 groups. Office 365 groups make a lot of sense. Once you get your head wrapped around them, from a management standpoint, they do make a lot of sense. So Julia's probably pretty smart there. Looking at some other questions. How do I feel about using Teams as a file share repository versus SharePoint? Well, that's the thing. Teams is using SharePoint in the background, so you don't have to choose. You can access the files in Teams or in SharePoint or however. So getting your head wrapped around that is complicated. But yeah, you don't have to choose. It's the same either way. SysKit folks, we've got a minute left. Do you guys have anything else that you want to say? Are we good?
Hi, we are good. I just wanted to thank you for a beautifully done webinar. It was very informative. So we didn't answer all questions, being that there were so many, but we'll try to answer them all in the coming days and email the askers.
Yeah. Yeah, and again, reach out to me, folks, at Todd Klindt on Twitter, todd@toddklindt.com in the email. Happy to help out, however.
Okay, thank you, Todd, and thanks to everybody for attending our webinar. At the end, you will have a quick survey. You can fill it out if you have a few minutes,
Well, say nice
give
things.
us.
I'm asking them to say nice things.
Yeah. I'm sure they will, because it was really nice. So that's all. Thank you, and see you in a few weeks for another SysKit webinar.